She is sitting near a window at Sheffield Manor Lodge with a needle in her hand, and for a moment, if you did not know better, you would think you were looking at a woman with nothing more urgent to occupy her than a piece of linen and a length of coloured silk. It is sometime in the middle years of the 1570 seconds. The light through the diamond panes is thin and grey, the kind of northern English light that never quite commits to brightness, and it falls across a piece of embroidery stretched taut on a frame, a design copied carefully from a small printed book of emblems. Under that image, in careful stitched letters, a Latin motto is taking shape below her needle one pass at a time. Viresic vulner virtus. Virtue grows stronger from a wound. She works the needle with real skill, drawing the silk through the linen in short, even strokes. And beside her, close enough that their two frames nearly touch, sits another woman entirely absorbed in the same slow labour, a formidable Derbyshire gentlewoman named Elizabeth Talbot, Countess of Shrewsbury. Known to nearly everyone in England by the name she carried from an earlier marriage, Bess of Hardwick. The two of them have spent whole afternoons like this one, needle to needle, choosing their emblems from the same borrowed book, a hand from a cloud, a cat watching a mouse, a phoenix rising from flame, each image selected and stitched with a care that suggests these two women understand precisely what they are doing when they choose a motto about wounds and growing strength. Her gown today is dark, well made, trimmed at the wrist and throat in a manner that keeps every rule of rank a queen is required to keep. Her hair dressed under a jewelled caul, her hands, when they are not occupied with the needle, folded with the unhurried composure of a woman who has been taught since infancy exactly how a queen's hands are meant to rest. Nothing in this room announces itself as a prison. There is a fire in the grate, tapestries on the walls, silver plate laid out on a nearby cupboard for display, servants moving quietly at the edges of the chamber, and at the center of it, a woman working a piece of embroidery with the calm, unbroken attention of someone entirely at her leisure. This is Mary Stuart, Queen of Scots by birth, briefly Queen Consort of France by marriage, and for close to a decade already by the time this particular afternoon takes place, the uncrowned, unconvicted, and entirely undefeated prisoner of her own royal cousin, Elizabeth of England. Beneath the needlework, beneath the careful gown and the composed hands, the story is far more complicated, far more uncomfortable, and far more human than any quiet afternoon of embroidery. This is a queen who cannot leave this house without an armed escort. This is a queen whose letters are read by strangers before they ever reach her hands, and read again by other strangers after they leave them. This is a queen whose joints have already begun to seize and swell under that composed sitting posture, whose damp stone lodgings have started slowly and irreversibly to attack a body still in its early 30s, and whose fear of poison runs deep enough that every dish set in front of her passes first through the hands and the mouth of someone paid to test it. The needle keeps moving. The motto keeps taking shape, one stitch at a time, virtue growing stronger from a wound, and somewhere underneath that quiet, composed image is 19 years of a woman's life that history has mostly agreed to remember only in outline. This is the story of what her closest servants, the French physicians who treated her aching limbs, the Scottish and English gentlewomen who dressed her and slept near her and smuggled her letters, and even the noblemen paid by the crown to guard her, actually recorded about the day-to-day reality of that captivity. The reality that never once appears in a portrait and rarely survives in the tidy chronological summaries most retellings settle for. This is the England of the 1570 seconds and 1580 seconds, a country still settling into a Protestant religious order less than 2 decades old, ruled by a queen, Elizabeth I, who has never married, has no named heir, and now finds herself holding, in effect, the most dangerous houseguest in Europe. Mary arrived in England in May of 1568, not as a conquered enemy, and not as an invited guest, but as a queen fleeing her own kingdom after a catastrophic defeat at the Battle of Langside, crossing the Solway Firth by fishing boat with a small remaining party of loyal Scots, for help reclaiming her throne. What she received instead, and would go on receiving for nearly 19 years, was captivity, moved from castle to castle and manor to manor across the cold interior counties of England, watched, guarded, considerably crueler for the absence of either. Every person inside that household, every French cook, every Scottish gentlewoman, every English guard standing watch at the gate, is navigating a daily physical and political reality that the official record of this period has largely agreed never to describe in any real detail. This hour is that description. Not a romantic one, and not a grim one either, simply an honest one. Built from the letters her keeper wrote home about her, the journal her own physician kept of her final months, and the household accounts that quietly tracked what she ate, how she slept, and what her body was slowly costing her. Before we go any further into that record, if the kind of patient, carefully sourced history that looks past the portrait and into the actual daily texture of a life, something you find worth your time, take a moment to subscribe. It helps this kind of research keep getting made, and if there is a particular imprisoned queen, a particular castle, or a particular decade of English history you would like to see examined this closely, leave it in a comment. I read every one of them. We will look at the damp that soaked into the plaster of her rooms and the joints of her own body. We will look at the physicians who tried, with the tools their century actually gave them, to treat a woman crippled by pain before she reached 40. We will look at the constant, exhausting labor of running a foreign queen's household inside a hostile country, the disputes over firewood and water, the meals tasted before she was allowed to touch them, the letters written in cipher and smuggled inside the bung of a beer barrel, and the small, determined household of servants who chose, year after year, to stay beside her. We will look, too, at the secret mass held behind shuttered windows, the marriage that quietly broke apart under the strain of guarding her, and the 16 dishes laid out each evening on a table belonging to a woman who was, in nearly every other respect that mattered, no longer free at all. Let us begin where her imprisonment itself began, not with the crown she had already lost, but with the body that would spend the next 19 years absorbing the cost of losing it. Her name, for the purposes of this hour, is Isabel Carruthers, and in the summer of 1568 she is 19 years old, the third daughter of a modest landholding family from Dumfriesshire in the Scottish borders, close enough to the English frontier that her father's household had spent her entire childhood. And the shifting loyalties of great lords she would never meet. Isabel does not exist under that exact name in any surviving household roll. She stands here for a real and well-documented category of woman, the lesser Scottish and French gentlewomen who followed Mary into English captivity, not because they were compelled to, but because they chose to, and whose individual names survive today, when they survive at all, only in scattered wardrobe accounts, ambassadors' letters, and the very rare will or memoir that happen to be preserved. Isabel is not one of the famous names among Mary's attendants, not one of the 4 Marys who had crossed to France with her as children decades earlier. Women like Mary Seton, whose own extraordinary skill at dressing hair the French court itself had once admired, and who would remain at Mary's side through most of these years of captivity, before ill health finally forced her into a French convent in 1583. Isabel joins the household a little later, in the disordered weeks after the defeat at Langside, a minor gentlewoman recommended to Mary's service by a boarder's family with old, complicated loyalties to the Scottish crown, grateful for the position and entirely unprepared for what the position would actually require of her. Physically, Isabel is unremarkable in the particular way her position required, of middling height, brown-haired, her complexion already beginning, by her late 20s, to show the effects of long winters spent indoors under smoking chimneys. Her hands are rough at the knuckle from constant needlework, since embroidery is not simply Mary's private amusement, but one of the household's few sanctioned occupations, hour after hour of fine stitching that leaves every woman doing it with the same small permanent stiffness in the fingers by middle age. She carries a low, persistent ache across her shoulders that she privately blames on the years of standing required to dress and undress a queen through layer after layer of formal clothing, and a cough that returns every winter without fail, and that she has stopped mentioning to anyone since a chronic cough was in a household as damp as this one. Simply the ordinary condition of being alive through an English winter. What is expected of Isabel, day in and day out, has almost nothing in common with the leisured, decorative picture most people carry of a lady in waiting. She rises before her mistress to help prepare the day's first fire and warm what water can reasonably be warmed, assists with the long, exacting process of dressing a woman who insists, even in captivity, on every formal element of royal presentation, sits with Mary to the long embroidery afternoons that have become one of the Queen's few genuine comforts, helps manage correspondence that must be copied, hidden, or destroyed, depending on who happens to be watching that week, and takes her turn along with 2 or 3 other women, sleeping close enough to Mary's own bed to be roused instantly if the Queen's health, which by the mid-1570s has become a source of real and constant worry, takes a sudden turn in the night. There is one particular habit of Isabel's that no household account would ever have thought worth recording, because it belonged entirely to her and to no one else in that chamber. On the coldest nights, after the Queen had finally settled, the candles had been reduced to a single guttering stub, Isabel would press her stocking feet flat against the warm brick her mistress's own feet had rested on earlier that evening, a small, private theft of borrowed warmth she never once admitted to anyone, not out of any real fear of punishment, but because admitting to cold in this household felt uncomfortably close to admitting that the Queen's own suffering, which was constant and considerably worse, made her own smaller discomforts unworthy of mention. The particular stretch of years this hour is going to walk through together begins in earnest in February of 1569, when Mary and her household arrived at a cold ancient fortress in Staffordshire called Tutbury Castle, and Isabel, along with every other woman inside that household, discovered exactly what kind of imprisonment 19 years of English captivity was actually going to feel like against her own skin. If you picture a captive queen's castle at all, you probably picture something closer to the setting of a Sunday costume drama. Thick walls, admittedly, and guards, admittedly, but otherwise a place of reasonable comfort, tapestried halls and roaring fires, cold perhaps in the way any old stone building is cold, but livable, dignified, appropriate to the rank of the woman confined inside it. Tutbury Castle, the first of Mary's long-term English prisons, and the one she would return to more than once over the following decade and a half, gives that comfortable picture almost nothing to stand on. Tutbury sits on a steep mound above the River Dove, on the border between Staffordshire and Derbyshire, a properly ancient fortress that had already been standing for 4 centuries by the time Mary arrived there in February of 1569, and it had not been meaningfully maintained as a royal residence in generations. The surrounding land was low, marshy, prone to flooding, the river running close enough that damp rose from the ground itself in a way no amount of fires or fresh rushes could fully counter, and the castle's own aging fabric, its wet plaster, its warped and ill-fitting old carpentry, its drafts that no closed door seemed able to stop, meant that cold and moisture were not occasional visitors to Mary's rooms, but a more or less permanent condition of living inside them. Mary herself wrote about it repeatedly and in specific, exasperated detail, complaining in letters to the French ambassadors at the English court, first Bertrand de Salignac de la Motte-Fenelon, and later Michel de Castelnau, about the state of her lodgings, the damp that soaked into every surface, the plaster still wet on the walls when she was first installed there, the general unfitness of the building for anyone's health, let alone the health of a queen already beginning to suffer from pain in her joints. Her keeper for most of these years, George Talbot, 6th Earl of Shrewsbury, was placed in charge of her custody by Elizabeth's own government in 1569 and would remain her principal jailer, with only brief interruptions, for the following 14 years, a length of service that cost him a considerable portion of his own fortune and a significant portion of his health and peace of mind as well. Shrewsbury's own letters back to the Royal Council in London form one of the most detailed surviving records of what it actually cost, in plain terms, to keep a queen imprisoned in a decaying medieval fortress, itemized complaints about the expense of maintaining a household that had grown by the early 1572s, well beyond the 15 or so attendants Mary had originally been permitted, request for additional funds to repair roofing and glazing that the Crown was reluctant to approve, and repeated, increasingly weary requests to be relieved of a duty that had begun to consume both his finances. The tapestries that hung across Mary's chamber walls at Tutbury, the same rich hangings a casual visitor might have mistaken for simple decoration, were doing genuine structural work, hung specifically to block the worst of the drafts coming through gaps in the old stonework and around windows that no longer sat quite true in their frames. The logic was entirely practical. A heavy woven hanging trapped a layer of still air between the fabric and the cold wall behind it, providing real insulation in a building with no other reliable way of holding warmth inside a room. But the same hangings that blocked the drafts also trapped the smoke from the room's fires and the moisture rising steadily from the ground beneath the castle, so that Mary's chambers, sealed as tightly as her household could manage against the cold, became close, smoky. Then an atmosphere her own physicians would later connect directly to the decline in her health. For Isabel, the physical reality of Tutbury settled into her body within weeks of arrival, in ways she noticed long before she had words for what was actually happening to her. Her woolen stockings, no matter how carefully dried before the fire each evening, never seemed to lose a faint, persistent dampness by morning, and the wooden chest, where she kept her few personal belongings, developed a fine grey bloom of mildew across anything left folded too long against its inner boards. She learned in her first Tutbury winter to sleep in as many layers as decency and practicality allowed, and still woke most mornings with her joints stiff enough that she needed several minutes of slow movement before her hands worked properly again, a stiffness she initially blamed on youth and inexperience. Watching the Queen's own far more severe suffering unfold over the following years, understood as the early ordinary cost of simply existing inside that particular building through an English winter. The broader context here matters enormously for understanding why Tutbury in particular has earned its reputation among historians of Mary's captivity as the single worst of all her English prisons. The historian Antonia Fraser, whose 1969 biography remains one of the most thorough accounts of Mary's life, describes Tutbury as a place Mary genuinely dreaded returning to, worse by a considerable margin than any of the other properties her keeper maintained. And the biographer John Guy, whose more recent Life of Mary draws extensively on the surviving Shrewsbury correspondence, notes that even Shrewsbury himself, a man with no particular sympathy to spare for his prisoner's comfort, complained to London about the state of the building he had been ordered to hold her in. Living history experiments reconstructing Tudor and Elizabethan domestic conditions have repeatedly confirmed what the letters already suggest, that a stone building on marshy ground, heated only by open fires and sealed against drafts with heavy cloth, produces exactly the kind of persistent, penetrating damp that period medicine associated, correctly as it happens, with a whole cluster of joint and respiratory complaints. Mary was not exaggerating for sympathy when she wrote to Castelnau about the state of her rooms. She was describing, in plain and repeated detail, a building actively working against her body every single day she remained inside it. There is something worth pausing on in the fact that the very stone walls meant to hold the queen securely were also, quietly and continuously, doing a second kind of damage that had nothing to do with security at all. Tutbury was chosen for its remoteness from the sea and its distance from any port a rescue attempt might use, a location decided entirely around the question of keeping Mary in, with apparently no serious consideration given to what a marshy, 400-year-old fortress would do to the health of anyone actually required to live inside it for years at a stretch. And critically, everybody in that household, from the Queen herself down to the newest chamberer scrubbing pots in the kitchen, was breathing the same smoke, sleeping under the same damp hangings, and paying, in one degree or another, the same physical price for a location chosen entirely for its convenience to her jailers. Which brings us to a question nobody in that household ever asked aloud, but that every single person inside it was quietly, constantly managing the question of who, exactly, was listening. If you picture surveillance in the 16th century at all, you probably picture something fairly crude. A guard posted at a door, perhaps a servant paid to report the occasional overheard remark, but nothing especially systematic, nothing that would resemble what a modern audience thinks of as genuine intelligence work. The actual apparatus built around Mary's household, particularly from the mid-1570s onward, was considerably more sophisticated than that comfortable assumption allows, and it only grew more thorough as the years passed and the threat she represented to Elizabeth's own security became harder for the English government to dismiss. The man principally responsible for that apparatus was Sir Francis Walsingham, Elizabeth's principal secretary and the closest thing Elizabethan England had to a spymaster, a deeply committed Protestant who regarded Mary, correctly as later events would prove, as the single most dangerous rallying point available to England's Catholic minority and to any foreign power hoping to see Elizabeth removed from her throne. Walsingham's network of informants, intercepted couriers, and paid double agents extended into every corner of Mary's household life that his resources could reach, and by the 1580 that reach was extensive. Letters addressed to her were opened, copied, and in some cases altered before being resealed and delivered as though nothing had happened. Visitors to the household were vetted, and in several documented instances, servants inside Mary's own retinue had, whether through bribery, genuine, ideological sympathy, or simple fear, been turned into sources reporting back to Walsingham's agents on the everyday texture of the Queen's private conversations. For a household already managing the daily physical demands of illness, cold, and constant relocation, this second, invisible layer of scrutiny added its own particular exhaustion, a need for near-constant self-editing that never fully switched off, even in the supposed privacy of the Queen's own bedchamber. Mary's own correspondence from these years shows a woman acutely aware of the risk developing and relying on cipher systems for anything truly sensitive, communicating in code with sympathizers abroad, and instructing her secretaries in methods of concealment that ranged from simple substitution alphabets to, in later years, considerably more elaborate systems developed with the help of exiled Catholic agents on the continent. None of these precautions, as later events would prove with brutal finality, were ever quite sufficient against an adversary as patient and as well-resourced as Walsingham's network eventually became. Isabel's own role inside this quietly paranoid household involved a skill she had never expected to need when she first joined Mary's service as a 19-year-old girl from the borders. The skill of knowing precisely which conversations could safely happen in a room with an open door and which required the household's small number of deeply trusted servants to stand watch outside it first. She learned to recognize the particular quality of a letter that needed to disappear into a hollowed bookbinding or a false bottom box rather than sit openly on a writing desk. And she learned, over years of practice, to keep her own face carefully blank during the routine searches that became, particularly, an unpredictable and unannounced feature of household life. More than once during her service, Isabel watched English officers go through Mary's own private chests and papers, while the Queen stood by in silence, her composure by that point so thoroughly practiced that even Isabel, who had known her for over a decade, found it plainly difficult to read what she was actually feeling underneath it. The broader context surrounding this atmosphere of surveillance connects directly to the shifting political calculus in London across these same 2 decades. Early in Mary's captivity, during the Tutbury and Wingfield years of the late 1562 and early 1570s, the restrictions on her household, while real, were considerably looser than they would later become, a reflection of an English government still uncertain how to categorize her: a deposed foreign queen, a guest, a hostage, a prisoner. All 4 descriptions circulating at different moments, depending on who in Elizabeth's council happened to be writing the correspondence that week. The uncovering of one plot after another, connected, even loosely, to Mary's name: the Ridolfi plot of 1571, the Throckmorton plot of 1583, and eventually the Babington conspiracy this hour will examine in detail later on. The historian Alison Weir, in her extensive study of the period surrounding Mary's downfall, has traced this hardening process in detail, noting that each successive plot, whatever Mary's own actual degree of knowledge or involvement, gave Walsingham and his allies on the council fresh justification for tightening the household's isolation, restricting her correspondence further, and eventually placing her, in her final year of captivity, under the considerably stricter and more austere guardianship of a committed Puritan gentleman named Sir Amias Paulet, whose approach to her custody this hour we'll return to before the story reaches its end. There is a quiet observation worth sitting with here, before this hour turns to the physical toll that watching, waiting, and near constant relocation took on the body of the woman at the center of all of it. A household under this kind of scrutiny does not experience its confinement through locked doors and armed guards, real as both of those things were. It experiences confinement through 1,000 small, accumulated acts of self-restraint, a sentence left unfinished because a servant entered the room, a letter burned rather than sent, a face schooled into blankness during a search that might on any given occasion. Isabel Carruthers spent the better part of 2 decades practicing exactly that particular discipline, and so, at far greater personal cost, did the Queen she served. Close your eyes for a moment and picture what 19 years of imprisonment does to a body that entered captivity as a young athletic woman, still in her 20s, a queen who had once ridden for hours in pursuit of her own rebellious lords. Most people, asked to picture that transformation, imagine something gradual and gentle, a slow softening, perhaps a loss of the outdoor color in her face. What her own physicians actually recorded in careful, repeated detail across nearly 2 decades of treatment was something closer to a body being methodically dismantled by its surroundings. Mary arrived in England in 1568, a physically capable woman in her mid-20s, and by the early 1582, still not yet 40 years old, she had become someone who required assistance simply to cross a room. her chronic joint pain, which contemporary accounts and later medical historians alike describe using the general Elizabethan term rheumatism, a catch-all diagnosis covering a range of what modern medicine would separate into distinct inflammatory, began appearing in her letters and in her physician's reports as early as the Tutbury years, and worsened steadily and more or less continuously from there. By 1581, according to household records examined by the physician and medical historian Sir Arthur McNulty, whose detailed clinical study of Mary's recorded illnesses remains one of the most thorough attempts to reconstruct her medical history from surviving documents, requiring a servant on either side to support her weight on the rare occasions she attempted it, and increasingly relying on a chair carried between rooms by her own household staff, rather than walking at all. Her right arm and hip caused her particular, repeated distress. Pain, severe enough on her worst days, that she could not hold a pen to write her own letters, could not stand for the fittings her formal clothing required, and could not, on several documented occasions, even manage to sit upright through a full meal. The physicians attending her across these years form their own small, quietly heroic thread through this story. In the earlier Tutbury and Sheffield years, her household physician was a Frenchman named Margarin du Castel, sometimes recorded as the Sieur du Castel, an older man by the time he took up the post. Working with the tools 16th century medicine actually offered for a condition modern rheumatology would recognize immediately and treat entirely differently. Herbal poultices applied hot to the affected joints, cupping to draw what the era's medical theory understood as excess and corrupted humors away from the site of pain, and prescribed baths in mineral water, believed, correctly as it happens, to offer genuine temporary relief from inflamed and swollen joints. By 1578, Mary herself grown frustrated enough with du Castel's advancing age, and she felt his declining effectiveness that she requested a replacement, and after a brief period served by a physician named Jacques de Lugerie, her household physician from 1582 onward, and for the remainder of her life was a younger Frenchman named Dominique Bourgoin. Trained in Paris and formally qualified only a handful of years before entering her service, who would go on to keep a detailed journal of her final months, and would be present, standing as close as the guards permitted, on the morning of her execution. Single most consistent treatment Mary's physicians turned to across these 2 decades, and the one her keeper Shrewsbury eventually built an entire building around, was the mineral spring at Buxton, in the Derbyshire Hills. Local physicians of the period, most notably a Derby doctor named John Jones, who published a treatise on the healing properties of the Buxton waters in 1572, dedicated directly to Shrewsbury himself, had already established the spring's reputation for treating exactly the kind of joint pain Mary suffered from. And between 1573 and 1584, she made the journey there under guard on at least 8 separate occasions, staying for periods of up to a month at a time in lodgings Shrewsbury had constructed specifically to house her during these visits. The waters themselves emerge from the ground at a naturally warm, consistent temperature, and bathing in them, then as now, offered real, if temporary relief from swollen and inflamed joints, a fact period medicine understood empirically, even without any real theory of why warm mineral water might ease that particular kind of pain. Tradition holds that on her final visit to Buxton in 1584, Mary used a diamond to scratch a short verse of farewell into a windowpane at the lodging where she had stayed, addressed to the waters themselves and their promise of relief she now suspected she would never enjoy again. Private gesture of grief for one of the only genuine comforts her captivity had ever offered her. For Isabel, the Queen's declining mobility reshaped the daily rhythm of the entire household in ways that went well beyond simple sympathy. She and the other gentlewomen took on, gradually and without any formal announcement, an increasing share of the physical tasks Mary herself could no longer manage. guiding her arm during the short walks her physicians still recommended for circulation, adjusting cushions and braziers through long afternoons when even sitting upright caused visible discomfort, and learning to read, in the set of the Queen's jaw or the particular stillness of her hands, exactly how much pain she was working to conceal from visitors and ambassadors who came expecting to find a queen. Isabel remembers, from these years, the specific weight of Mary's arm across her own shoulders during the worst of the winter flare-ups, a weight that felt, she later reflected, considerably heavier than the Queen's actual slight frame should have accounted for, as though pain itself carried its own physical mass. The broader context surrounding Mary's declining health reveals something quietly striking that her own physicians had no way of understanding. Modern doctors and medical historians who have since examined the detailed record of her symptoms, the joint pain, the recurring severe abdominal attacks accompanied by vomiting that troubled her for roughly 25 years, the headaches, the eventual physical decline that left her looking, by her final imprisonment, considerably older than her actual 44 years, have proposed several competing explanations, ranging from porphyria, a metabolic disorder that has also been suggested for other members of European royalty, to a 1985 study published in a medical journal that raised the possibility of Marfan syndrome, a connective tissue disorder entirely unknown to 16th century medicine as a potential underlying cause for the specific pattern of her joint and skeletal complaints. No single diagnosis has achieved anything like scholarly consensus, and it is worth remembering that her own physicians, working with genuine skill within an entirely different medical framework, had no access to any of these modern categories at all. What they had instead was patient, hands-on care, hot poultices applied by candlelight, careful attention to her diet and rest, and a willingness repeated across 2 decades and 2 different physicians to keep trying every remedy available to them for a condition that never once, across the whole of her captivity, showed any sign of lasting improvement. There is something worth sitting with in the fact that the same damp stone walls examined earlier in this hour, the walls Mary complained about in letter after letter to her French allies, were very likely a direct and significant contributor to the specific worsening physical suffering her own doctors spent 2 decades trying to treat. The prison itself was in a very real and physical sense slowly attacking the body of the woman confined inside it, and everyone in that household, her physicians, her gentlewomen, and Mary herself, understood this connection with a clarity that makes the era's insistence on housing her in exactly these buildings feel considerably less like an oversight, considerably more like an actively uncomfortable political choice that nobody in London felt any particular urgency to correct. Now the household itself, because a queen's captivity, isolated as it might have looked from the outside, was never actually a small or a simple thing to manage, and the daily friction of running it was where the reality of Mary's confinement became hardest for anyone inside that household to ignore. If you picture a captive queen's staff at all, you probably picture a handful of loyal attendants, perhaps a dozen at most, quietly managing a modest set of private rooms. Mary's actual household grew considerably larger than that comfortable image allows, beginning with roughly 15 attendants permitted at the start of her captivity in 1568, and expanding over the following years to somewhere between 40 and 50 people by the 1582nd, a genuine miniature court, complete with her own physician, an apothecary, a personal cook, a master of the household, secretaries, grooms, and a considerable body of lower servants handling the unglamorous daily labor of laundry, cleaning, and provisioning. This entire retinue existed as a household entirely separate from Shrewsbury's own staff, French in its language and its habits at the core, Catholic in its private religious practice, and dependent for nearly everything from firewood to fresh water to the meat on its table on an English keeper who had not asked for the burden and who felt its financial and administrative weight every single day. The actual friction this arrangement produced was constant, and at times sharply bitter. Mary's French and Scottish servants, accustomed to a certain standard of household provisioning from their years in France and at the Scottish court, repeatedly found themselves negotiating and frequently arguing with Shrewsbury's own English staff over the basic materials of daily life. Sufficient firewood to keep the Queen's rooms warm through the worst of the Staffordshire and Derbyshire winters, clean water for washing and cooking, rather than whatever happened to be most convenient to draw, and the general question of precedence between two households forced to occupy the same buildings while answering to entirely different loyalties and entirely different budgets. Shrewsbury's own surviving correspondence with the Royal Council in London complains repeatedly about the expense of provisioning Mary's household at the Standard. Her own servants insisted upon, and several of his letters described the exhausting, ongoing negotiation required simply to keep both staffs functioning under the same roof without the daily friction boiling over into something considerably worse. Isabel's own part in these disputes fell more often than she would have liked to the unglamorous business of securing what the Queen's chamber actually needed on any given day, standing in a cold outer passage, arguing with an English steward over a delivery of firewood that had arrived half the promised quantity, or negotiating 2%. 1. Her improving but still accented English for water drawn fresh rather than from whatever barrel happened to be nearest the kitchen door. She learned over years of this particular battle precisely which of Shrewsbury's servants could be reasoned with and which required a small gift, a length of ribbon, a favor remembered and returned later, to secure even the most basic cooperation, and she came to understand this constant grinding negotiation as its own particular kind of labor, invisible to anyone outside the household, and every bit as exhausting in its own quiet way as the physical work of dressing and attending the Queen herself. The broader context surrounding this daily friction connects directly to the genuine financial strain Mary's captivity placed on the man responsible for it. Shrewsbury received an allowance from the Crown intended to cover the cost of Mary's household, but that allowance, historians examining his surviving accounts have consistently found, fell well short of what her actual establishment required, particularly as her retinue grew through the 1572nd, and Shrewsbury increasingly found himself covering the shortfall from his own considerable but not inexhaustible personal fortune. This financial pressure filtered downward through every level of both households, shaping exactly the kind of disputes over firewood and water that Isabel spent so much of her own energy managing. Since a steward instructed to economize wherever possible had every reasonable incentive to make Mary's servants fight for what her rank technically entitled her to receive without question. The historian Jenny Wormald, whose study of Mary's reign and captivity takes a notably unsentimental view of the political realities involved, has argued that Shrewsbury's genuine and repeated complaints about the cost of his charge should be read as sincere financial distress, a nobleman watching his own estate slowly bleed money to support a prisoner. The Crown itself seemed reluctant to properly fund. There is a quiet observation worth carrying forward from this particular strand of the story into everything that follows. A queen's captivity, examined closely, turns out to be built from an enormous accumulation of small, unglamorous administrative battles, rather than any single dramatic confrontation, a fight over firewood here, a negotiation over water there, each one individually forgettable, and each one a considerable part of what actually filled Isabel Carruthers' days. The grandeur of a queen's household, it turns out, rested on a foundation of exhausting, constant, entirely unrecorded negotiation, conducted by women whose names appear nowhere in the official history of this period at all. There is a particular kind of vigilance that has nothing to do with locked doors or armed escorts, one that instead follows a person to the dinner table and sits there with them through every single meal. And for Mary Stuart, that particular vigilance had been a fact of daily life since long before her English captivity ever began. If you picture the poisoning fears of a 16th century royal household, you probably picture something faintly theatrical. A servant dramatically sampling a goblet of wine before a suspicious monarch takes even a sip, a scene borrowed more from stage drama than from any real historical practice. The actual precautions built around Mary's table were considerably less theatrical and considerably more procedural, a quiet routine part of how every dish reached her at all, embedded so thoroughly into the household's daily rhythm. Mary's fear of poison was not an eccentric personal obsession invented for this hour's purposes. It was a rational response to a family history and a political environment that had given her repeated, specific reasons to distrust her own food. Her own father-in-law, Henry II of France, had died from a jousting accident rather than poison. But the French and Scottish courts he had grown up moving through were both saturated with poisoning accusations, real and invented alike, used as political weapons against rivals with a frequency that made the fear itself a perfectly reasonable inheritance for any royal person of her generation. By the time she reached English captivity, with a hostile government holding her, rival queen who had every political motive to see her quietly removed, and a household small enough that a single compromised servant could plausibly reach her table, Mary's insistence on careful food security reflected genuine, well-founded caution rather than any kind of exaggerated paranoia. The actual mechanics of that caution involved her own dedicated kitchen staff, a personal cook answerable only to her own household rather than to Shrewsbury's, and, according to the detailed household accounts surviving from these years, Noy, formally designated taster whose specific responsibility was to sample dishes before they reached the Queen's own table. This was not a single dramatic gesture performed once before an entire meal, but a distributed, ongoing practice built into the kitchen's daily routine. Dishes tasted as they were prepared, and again before serving, wine drawn from casks her own household controlled rather than casks shared with the wider garrison, and a general wariness around any food or drink that arrived from outside sources her own staff had not directly overseen. Her apothecary, part of the same expanded household this hour has already described, maintained a small store of substances believed at the time to offer protection against poison, most notably a bezoar stone, a hardened mineral mass formed in the digestive tract of certain animals and widely credited across Renaissance Europe, with the power to neutralize toxins when placed in contact with food or drink or worn against the skin. Later, inventories of Mary's own physician's possessions, taken after her death, list exactly this kind of item among his effects: a small gold bottle holding a bezoar stone and a separate silver bottle holding another stone, specifically kept as a remedy against poison. Tangible evidence of just how seriously this precaution was maintained across the whole of her household right up to her final months. For Isabel, the household's poison anxiety translated into a specific set of habits she carried out without ever fully questioning them, since questioning them would have meant questioning a precaution the entire household, Queen included, treated as simple common sense. She learned early in her service never to hand the Queen a cup that had passed through unfamiliar hands, to watch, almost without conscious thought, whenever unfamiliar servants from Shrewsbury's own staff brought dishes anywhere near Mary's table, and to understand the household's designated taster not as a curious ceremonial figure, but as someone performing a plainly necessary function that every person in that chamber quietly depended on. Isabel remembers one particular evening, During the tense early 1580 seconds, as Walsingham's investigations into plots connected to Mary's name multiplied, when a visiting nobleman's gift of preserved fruit arrived at the household unannounced, and the Queen's own steward refused politely to allow a single piece of it near Mary's table until it had been examined and tasted by her own people first. The broader context surrounding this precaution connects to just how seriously Elizabethan England as a whole took the danger of poison. A threat medicine of the period had almost no reliable way to detect and almost no effective way to treat once ingestion had occurred. English law itself had, within living memory of Mary's captivity, treated poisoning as a crime deserving its own uniquely severe punishment. A 1531 statute passed under Henry VIII having classified it as a form of treason punishable by boiling to death, a penalty so severe it reflects just how much dread the possibility of poison actually provoked across every level of English society. Mary's own precautions, examined against that broader cultural backdrop, look considerably less like the isolated anxiety of a single frightened prisoner, and considerably more like an entirely rational household adopting the same protective habits any prudent noble family of the era, royal or otherwise, would have considered basic good sense. There is a quiet observation worth sitting with here before this hour turns to a different, and, in its own way, considerably more intimate form of vigilance. A queen, surrounded by armed guards, open letters, and a network of paid informants had, by simple necessity, learned to treat even her own dinner table as a place requiring constant, careful watching, and the household around her, Isabel included, absorbed that same watchfulness into the most basic, until pouring a cup of wine and checking who had carried it into the room had become, for everyone involved, simply another ordinary part of the working day. Meanwhile, a different kind of vigilance was unfolding each morning in whatever room of whichever castle had been set aside, imperfectly as it was, for the one practice Mary refused to abandon under any circumstances her captivity presented her with, the private, unbroken continuation of her Catholic faith. If you picture religious observance in a captive Catholic queen's household, you probably picture something furtive and cramped. A single hurried prayer whispered behind a locked door, the entire practice reduced by necessity to its barest possible minimum. The actual religious life Mary maintained throughout her English captivity was considerably fuller and more consistent than that image suggests, even as it operated under real and constant restriction from a Protestant government. Mary had negotiated from the earliest days of her English captivity the right to maintain her own chapel and her own priest, a concession Elizabeth's government granted with evident reluctance and monitored closely for the whole of the following 2 decades. A dedicated room within whatever residence she currently occupied was set aside for Mass, celebrated according to the old rite by a priest attached permanently to her household, and Mary herself, by every surviving account, observed the full calendar of Catholic feasts and fasts with a consistency that impressed even some of her Protestant keepers, rising for early Mass, keeping the appointed days of abstinence, and maintaining devotional practices that had remained essentially unchanged since her childhood at the French court. This was not the reduced, symbolic religion of a woman simply going through motions to preserve some thin connection to her past. It was a genuinely sustained practice conducted daily for 19 years, under conditions specifically designed to discourage it. The tension this created with her English keepers varied considerably, depending on who happened to hold her custody at any given point. Shrewsbury himself, for most of his 14 years as her jailer, adopted a broadly pragmatic approach, tolerating the private chapel as an accepted cost of managing a difficult prisoner without provoking unnecessary conflict. So long as her religious practice remained strictly private and made no attempt to extend its influence beyond her own household walls, That arrangement shifted considerably once Mary's final keeper, Sir Amyas Paulet, a committed and rather severe Puritan gentleman, assumed custody of her in 1585. Paulet regarded Mary's Catholic worship with open distaste, restricted her chapel practices more tightly than any previous keeper had attempted, and, in one particularly pointed act recorded in his own correspondence, the physical symbol of continued royal status that every previous keeper had allowed her to maintain even in captivity, a gesture Mary herself received, by Paulet's own account, with genuine and visible distress. For Isabel, the household's religious life required a particular kind of careful, practiced discretion that extended well beyond the chapel doors themselves. She learned to recognize which of Shrewsbury's own household staff could be trusted not to report on the timing and frequency of Mass, which visiting officials required the household's devotional objects, rosaries, small devotional books, a portable altar cloth, to disappear into hidden compartments before they arrived, and how to participate outwardly in whatever public religious observance the household's official status required, without ever compromising the private faith she and most of Mary's other attendants continued to practice underneath it. Isabel remembers from her own service the particular quiet tension of Mass celebrated in a room with its shutters deliberately closed against the possibility of an unwelcome witness passing the window. The priest's voice kept low, every gesture performed with a practiced economy of people who had learned, across years of repetition, exactly how much space their faith could safely occupy in a household never fully free of observation. The broader context surrounding this sustained religious practice matters for understanding just how central Mary's Catholicism was to her own sense of identity, and to the political danger English authorities believed she represented. Elizabeth's government did not restrict Mary's worship out of simple religious intolerance alone. It restricted her worship because Mary's continued, visible Catholic devotion functioned as a genuine rallying point for English Catholics who regarded her as their rightful queen, a fact that made every Mass celebrated inside her household. The historian John Guy has argued that Mary's faith, examined across the whole of her captivity, was never merely a private consolation, comforting as she plainly found it, but an inseparable part of the same royal identity she continued to insist upon in every other aspect of her captive life. The demand for a canopy of estate, the demand for full royal etiquette from her own household, and the demand to worship exactly as a Catholic queen of her rank had always worshipped, three expressions of the same fundamental refusal to accept that her imprisonment had actually changed who she was. There is a quiet observation worth carrying forward from this chapter of Isabel's service into everything that follows. A private chapel, tucked into whatever room a hostile government happened to permit it, was not a small or a passive thing inside that household. It was one of the very few spaces where Mary retained anything resembling genuine self-determination, and the women who helped preserve it, hiding a rosary here, closing a shutter there, understood themselves to be protecting something considerably larger than a simple religious habit. They were protecting the one part of their queen's identity that 19 years of captivity had never managed to touch. Sensory bridge. Close your eyes for a moment and consider what actually sat on a captive queen's table each evening, because the answer runs directly against the modest bread and water picture a word like imprisonment tends to conjure. If you picture a prisoner's diet at all, you probably picture deliberate deprivation, thin broth, stale bread, meals designed to remind a captive of exactly what her circumstances had reduced her to. Mary's own table, across most of her English captivity, offered nearly the opposite experience, an abundance that sat uneasily but consistently alongside every other genuine hardship this hour has already described. Household accounts surviving from these years show a queen served 2 substantial meals a day, each one offering as many as 16 separate dishes for her and her senior household to choose among. A scale of provisioning that reflected both her insistence on maintaining full royal state and Shrewsbury's own understanding that feeding her poorly would have been read by the watching courts of Catholic Europe as a calculated insult rather than a simple economy. The actual composition of those meals leaned heavily on meat and rich sauced dishes typical of elite tables across 16th century Europe, supplemented by whatever fish the household's religious calendar required on fasting days, and almost entirely lacking the fresh vegetables and varied produce. Quote, a gap common to elite tables of this period, generally rather than any particular deprivation unique to Mary's circumstances. Combined with the restricted movement this hour has already described, walks permitted only within closely guarded grounds, exercise limited by both security concerns, and as the years passed, by her own worsening joints, this rich, cumulative work on a body already under considerable strain from other directions, contributing to the noticeable weight gain her later portraits and visitor accounts both record, and very likely compounding the recurring digestive complaints, severe abdominal pain and vomiting, that her physicians never fully succeeded in treating. For Isabel, managing the Queen's table meant a constant, delicate negotiation between competing demands that had nothing to do with any shortage of food and everything to do with Mary's own particular relationship to what she ate. She learned to watch for the specific days when pain or low spirits left the Queen unable to manage more than a few bites of what her kitchen had prepared, to encourage without ever seeming to press, and to manage the quiet, practical logistics of a 16-dish spread for a woman whose appetite, by the later years of her captivity, had become as unpredictable as her health more generally. She remembers, too, the particular management required around the household's Buxton visits, when the mineral baths that eased Mary's joints also seemed, if only briefly, to restore some of her appetite for the gentle walking her physicians recommended, a small, temporary window of vitality that made the return to Sheffield's more sedentary routine afterward feel, to everyone who witnessed it, like watching a small light dim again. The broader context surrounding this abundance matters for understanding just how thoroughly food functioned at this level of society as a language of status rather than simple nourishment. A queen served thin, modest fare would have signaled to every ambassador and visitor who heard of it that her captors no longer regarded her as a monarch at all, and Shrewsbury, whatever his private exhaustion with the financial burden of housing her, understood that maintaining the outward form of a royal table. The historian Antonia Fraser has noted that this particular contradiction, a queen simultaneously stripped of freedom and lavishly overfed, captures something essential about the peculiar nature of Mary's imprisonment more broadly. A captivity built almost entirely around controlling her movement and her correspondence, while leaving the outward ceremony of her rank, including the ceremony of her table, very largely intact. There is a quiet observation worth sitting with here before this hour turns to the two people who govern nearly every other aspect of that same daily existence. A body can be richly fed and still, in every meaningful sense, be a body in captivity, and the 16 dishes arranged each evening on Mary's table were never a contradiction of her imprisonment so much as one more expression of it, generous in form, tightly controlled in substance. For Isabel, and for every other member of that household, the two people who mattered most in determining the daily texture of Mary's captivity were not the distant council in London, but the man and woman who actually held the keys, and the story of what happened between them became its own private drama, unfolding just under the surface of the household's daily routine. If you picture a Queen's jailer and his wife, you probably picture a simple, functional arrangement. Two people carrying out an unpleasant duty, together with a shared sense of obligation, and little personal complication attached to it. The actual relationship between George Talbot, Earl of Shrewsbury, and his formidable wife, Elizabeth, Countess of Shrewsbury, known across England as Bess of Hardwicke, was considerably more layered than that comfortable picture suggests, and its slow unravelling over the course of Mary's captivity became, by the final years of Shrewsbury's custody, a genuine crisis that reshaped the entire household around it. Bess of Hardwicke arrived at her marriage to Shrewsbury in 1567, already one of the most capable and independently wealthy women in England, a builder of great houses, a shrewd manager of estates, and a woman whose own social standing rivaled her husband's in almost every practical respect. In the earlier years of Mary's captivity, Bess and Mary developed a relationship that appears, from the surviving evidence, to have been one of genuine mutual regard, the two women spending long hours together over the same needlework that opened this very hour, and by some accounts developing something approaching real friendship across the barrier of Mary's captive status. The emblematic panels the two women stitched together during these years, portions of which survive today as what historians now call the Augsburg hangings, stand as physical evidence of hours spent in each other's company that went well beyond simple obligation. That relationship deteriorated sharply as the 1,580 seconds approached, for reasons that combined genuine personal grievance with the particular corrosive pressure of housing a captive queen inside your own marriage for over a decade. Bess grew convinced, and eventually said so openly enough that the rumor reached London and troubled Elizabeth's own council that her husband's relationship with his royal prisoner had grown improperly close. An accusation Shrewsbury denied with evident anger, and that most historians examining the surviving correspondence now regard as unlikely to have reflected any genuine impropriety, but that nonetheless poisoned the Shrewsbury marriage for its remaining years, and complicated Mary's own position inside a household, now split by open hostility between the two people responsible for her keeping. The marriage effectively collapsed by the early 1,580 seconds, with Bess and Shrewsbury living largely apart and conducting an increasingly bitter dispute over property and reputation that played out, uncomfortably, in full view of the very household Mary herself depended on for her daily care. For Isabel, the breakdown of the Shrewsbury marriage translated into a household atmosphere that grew steadily more strained and unpredictable through the early 1,580 seconds, servants uncertain which of the two principals actually held authority on a given matter. Instructions from Bess's own attendants sometimes directly contradicting instructions from Shrewsbury's staff, and Mary herself caught in the middle of a marital collapse she had not caused but could not escape, working carefully to avoid appearing to favor either side of a dispute that could, depending on how it resolved, meaningfully affect the conditions of her own continued captivity. Isabel remembers the particular tension of these final Shrewsbury years as different in character from the earlier dangers this hour has already described, less a matter of external threat and more a matter of navigating an increasingly dysfunctional household from the inside. Reading the mood of two feuding principals well enough to keep the Queen's own daily routine as stable as possible amid the surrounding chaos. The broader context surrounding this collapse connects to genuine exhaustion on Shrewsbury's part, after 14 years of a duty that had cost him enormously, in money, in his marriage, and by most accounts, in his own health and peace of mind as well. By 1584, Elizabeth's government finally agreed to relieve him of the burden, transferring Mary's custody first to Sir Ralph Sadler, an experienced and comparatively gentler administrator, and then, in the final chapter of her captivity, to Sir Amias Paulet, whose severe Puritan sensibilities and considerably stricter approach to security this hour has already introduced. The historian Alison Weir has described this final transfer of custody as marking a genuine hardening in how Mary's imprisonment was managed, a shift from the relatively personal, occasionally almost familial, dynamic that had characterized the Shrewsbury years, and considerably more attentive to the specific security failures that Walsingham and his allies believed had allowed previous plots to develop as far as they had. There is a quiet observation worth carrying forward from this particular chapter of the story into everything that follows. The two people responsible for Mary's daily captivity were not simple interchangeable functionaries carrying out a straightforward government assignment. They were a real married couple whose own private relationship buckled in slow and visible ways under the specific pressure of housing a captive queen for over a decade, and the household around them, Isabel included, absorbed every tremor of that collapse into the daily texture of their own working lives, learning. As households under strain so often must, to keep serving faithfully, even as the ground under their own authority structure shifted in ways nobody had fully explained to them. By the end of 1585, Mary's captivity had entered its final and most dangerous phase, and the particular danger this hour turns to now arrived, not through the castle gate under armed guard, but through something considerably smaller and considerably harder to detect, hidden inside the wooden bung of an ordinary beer barrel. If you picture how a closely watched prisoner might smuggle secret letters past a hostile government, you probably picture something dramatic: hollowed heel, a message swallowed and later recovered, the stuff of later spy fiction rather than 16th century household logistics. The actual system built to carry Mary's secret correspondence in and out of Chartley Hall, where she was moved under Sir Amias Paulet's custody at the end of 1585, was both simpler and, in its own way, more quietly ingenious than any of those dramatic alternatives, and it depended entirely on one of the most mundane deliveries any household received. 2. Its regular supply of beer from a local brewer in nearby Burton upon Trent. The system worked through a small waterproof leather packet slipped inside the hollow wooden bung that sealed each cask, arriving with the routine beer delivery and departing the same way, carried past Paulet's own guards without a second glance because nobody thought to search a barrel that arrived and left on an entirely predictable weekly schedule. Letters from Mary's Catholic sympathizers on the continent, and eventually from a young English Catholic gentleman named Anthony Babington, reached her by this route, and her own replies, dictated to her secretaries, and rendered into an elaborate cipher combining substitution symbols for individual letters with additional symbols standing in for entire common words and phrases, traveled back out the same way. For the better part of a year, this quiet, unremarkable channel appeared to Mary, and to everyone helping to operate it, as a genuine triumph of concealment, a way of maintaining contact with the wider Catholic world that her jailers had apparently failed entirely to detect. It had not, in fact, gone undetected at all. The entire beer barrel system had been engineered from its very first delivery by a young Catholic exile named Gilbert Gifford, ostensibly working on behalf of Mary's continental supporters, but in reality operating as a double agent for Sir Francis Walsingham, who had recruited him after his own arrest and interrogation months earlier. Every letter that passed through that bung in either direction was intercepted before it ever reached its intended recipient, copied, and passed to Walsingham's own cryptographer, a brilliant and meticulous code breaker named Thomas Phillibis, who deciphered Mary's supposedly secure correspondence with a thoroughness that left nothing meaningfully hidden from the English government at all. When Babington's letters to Mary began outlining an actual plot to assassinate Elizabeth and place Mary on the English throne with foreign military support, Walsingham did not move to intercept them. He allowed the correspondence to continue, watching and copying every exchange, waiting for the one piece of evidence that would prove, beyond any diplomatic argument Mary's supporters might later raise, that she herself had known of and effectively endorsed a plan to murder her royal cousin. That evidence arrived on the 17th of July 1586, When Mary, replying to Babington's letter through her usual cipher, discussed the planned rescue and the foreign invasion meant to support it without directly condemning the assassination itself, a reply Philip intercepted, deciphered, then, in a final and decisive act of forgery, appended with an additional postscript drawn in a plausible imitation of Mary's own cipher, requesting the names of the men who would carry out the killing. Whether Mary's original letter, without that forged edition, would alone have proven sufficient grounds for what followed remains actively debated among historians of the period. But the letter Walsingham eventually presented as evidence left almost no room for Mary's own defenders to argue that she had been an innocent bystander to a plot conducted entirely without her knowledge. For Isabel, the final months at Chartley carried a particular creeping unease that felt different in character from every earlier danger this hour has already described. The household's correspondence, always carefully managed, now flowed through a route everyone involved believed was entirely secure, and Isabel remembers the quiet, private optimism that briefly settled over parts of the household in the early months of 1586. That Mary's isolation might finally be loosening after years of steadily tightening restriction. She remembers too the specific horror of August the 11th that same year, when Mary, riding out from Chartley under the pretense of a hunting party, was suddenly surrounded by armed men and separated from her household entirely. Taken to a nearby house called Tixall, while soldiers descended on Chartley itself and tore through every room the Queen had occupied, seizing her papers, her cipher keys, and every scrap of correspondence her secretaries had not managed to destroy in time. Isabel was among the household members left behind at Chartley during those searches, and she remembers standing in a corridor while English officers emptied chests she herself had packed and organized only weeks earlier, understanding, with a clarity that made her physically unsteady, that whatever the beer barrels had actually carried, it had never once been secret at all. The broader context surrounding this collapse reveals, in the starkest terms, this hour has offered so far exactly how far Walsingham's intelligence apparatus had developed since the looser, more improvised surveillance of Mary's earlier captivity. Historians and cryptography scholars who have studied the Babington affair in detail generally regard it as one of the first documented instances in European history where a systematic program of cryptanalysis directly determined the outcome of a major political conspiracy. A technical triumph for Walsingham and Phillips that came at the direct and total cost of the one household this hour has spent so many hours inside. Mary herself was moved first to Tixall, and within weeks toward a formal trial that would take place that autumn at Fotheringhay Castle in Northamptonshire, a trial whose outcome, given the letter Phillips had already secured, was never seriously in doubt. There is a quiet observation worth sitting with here before this hour turns to what followed. A household that had spent nearly 2 decades learning to hide letters in bookbindings, to keep faces blank during searches, and to whisper mass behind closed shutters had in the end been undone by the one channel every person inside it had trusted completely, and the particular cruelty of that betrayal, invisible and bloodless as it was, left a mark on Isabel and on everyone else who had helped carry those small leather packets in and out of Chartley Hall, believing, right up until the moment the soldiers arrived, that they had finally found a way to keep something of their Queen's own voice truly free. There is one further discomfort this hour has not yet named directly, quieter than surveillance, quieter than illness, and in its own way harder for a modern listener to fully picture. The sheer, grinding length of the thing itself, the fact that nearly all of what this hour has described did not happen once, but happened in slightly varied form. Thousands of times across 19 consecutive years. If you picture a long captivity at all, you probably picture it compressed the way a biography necessarily compresses it. a handful of dramatic episodes standing in for entire decades of otherwise uneventful time. The actual texture of Mary's middle years, roughly from 1570 through the early 1582, when her custody rotated among Shrewsbury's various properties, Tutbury, Wingfield Manor, Chatsworth House, and above all, Sheffield Castle and the adjoining Sheffield Manor Lodge, was defined less by any single crisis and more by an accumulating, almost geological weight of ordinary days that simply kept arriving, one after another, with no end in sight and no reliable indication of when or whether that end might ever come. Sheffield itself, a substantial castle, and its associated manor house, set within a deer park Shrewsbury maintained specifically to allow Mary some limited, closely guarded exercise, became by far the most consistent backdrop of her captivity, and the household settled into routines so repetitive that Isabel later found she could barely distinguish one particular Tuesday from another. Embroidery in the morning, correspondence managed and concealed as the day required, a carefully rationed walk within the park under guard, evenings spent at cards or in quiet conversation, dictated how much of any of it actually happened. Wingfield Manor and Chatsworth offered occasional variation. Different rooms, different views. On one occasion, even a brief and closely supervised visit from Mary's own young son, James, whom she had not seen since infancy, and would, as it turned out, never see again. But the underlying rhythm of the days themselves changed remarkably little from one property to the next. The passage of this much time left its own mark on Mary that had nothing to do with any single illness or crisis, a mark her own household watched accumulate slowly enough that no one moment ever felt like the turning point, even though the cumulative change examined across the whole stretch of years. The active, athletic young woman who had once ridden for hours in pursuit of rebellious lords in Scotland grew, through a combination of restricted movement, a rich and starchy diet that offered one of her captivity's few remaining comforts, and the slow toll of her worsening joints, noticeably heavier by her middle 30s. Her, once, famously fine hair thinning and graying, early enough that she had by the early 1582 begun wearing wigs dressed to match its earlier auburn color. A small, private vanity that Isabel and the other gentlewomen managed with the same careful discretion. Visitors who had known Mary in her youth, and who were occasionally permitted brief, formal audiences with her during these years, sometimes remarked, in letters that survive in fragments, on how considerably older she appeared than her actual years, a premature aging her own household understood without ever quite saying so aloud. As one more cost of the specific captivity she was enduring, small comforts, gathered and guarded carefully across these same 14 years, did real work in keeping that long, monotonous middle stretch of captivity survivable. Mary kept a changing menagerie of small dogs throughout her English years, animals her household accounts record being fed, groomed, and occasionally replaced as older favorites died, along with caged songbirds whose presence softened rooms that otherwise offered little in the way of ordinary domestic warmth. She read widely, in French, Latin, and Scots, borrowing and requesting books through channels her keepers monitored as closely as they monitored everything else. And she continued composing her own verse, a private outlet for a woman whose every other form of expression had grown so heavily circumscribed. Isabel remembers these small animals and small pleasures less as sentimental decoration and more as genuine load-bearing structure, the modest daily architecture that kept an otherwise unbroken stretch of identical, closely watched days from simply grinding a person down to nothing at all. One particular departure marked this long middle period in a way Isabel felt more sharply than almost any single dramatic event this hour has already described. Mary Seton, the last remaining of the 4 Marys who had accompanied her to France as a small child, and one of the few attendants who had known her since before any of this captivity began, had remained at her side longer than any other original companion. Dressing her hair with a skill contemporaries specifically admired, and providing a form of companionship built on decades of shared history, no later arrival could ever fully replace. By 1583, Seton's own health, worn down by exactly the same damp, restricted conditions afflicting the queen she served, had deteriorated to the point that she could no longer continue in active service, and she left Mary's household that year for a French convent where she would live out the remainder of her own long life. For Isabel, watching that particular departure meant watching the queen lose the last living link to a childhood and a world that had existed before any of this captivity began. A loss Mary absorbed, by every account, with visible, lasting grief. One more quiet subtraction in a life that had already been defined for over a decade by the slow subtraction of nearly everything she had once taken for granted. The broader context surrounding this long, undramatic middle stretch of captivity matters because it corrects an understandable but genuinely misleading assumption about what sustained imprisonment actually does to a person. Popular memory tends to organize any captive life around its most dramatic episodes: a rebellion, a plot, a trial, an execution, and in doing so quietly erases the years of monotonous, accumulating ordinariness that made up the overwhelming majority of the actual lived experience. The historian Jenny Wormald has argued that this middle period, precisely because it lacks the narrative shape of a single crisis, is the part of Mary's captivity historians and popular accounts alike have most consistently under-examined, even though the sheer duration of that unbroken monotony. 14 years inside a rotation of the same handful of buildings, with the same restricted company, under the same unchanging surveillance, may have exacted a psychological toll every bit as real as any of the more dramatic dangers this hour has already described in detail. There is a quiet observation worth sitting with here before this hour turns, at last, toward the final chapter of this long story. Isabel Carruthers spent the greater part of 2 decades inside a captivity that offered almost nothing in the way of narrative momentum. No clear sense of progress, no reliable promise of an ending, simply one more identical morning arriving after another for years at a stretch. That particular kind of endurance, the ability to keep rising, keep dressing a queen, keep managing correspondence and firewood and quiet fear, year after year, with no assurance any of it would ever meaningfully change, deserves its own place in this story, considerably less dramatic than a rebellion or a cipher smuggled inside a beer barrel, but in its own patient, unglamorous way, just as demanding of the people who lived through it. The legal machinery that eventually made a formal trial possible had, in truth, been assembled well before Babington's own letters ever reached Chartley Hall. In the autumn of 1584, in the aftermath of an earlier plot to assassinate Elizabeth, England's Privy Councillors had drafted and circulated a document known as the Bond of Association. To the pledge signed by thousands of the country's leading subjects, committing themselves to hunt down and kill anyone found to have benefited from a successful attempt on the Queen's life. A pledge that named no one directly, but that every signatory understood. Mary herself, remarkably, chose to sign a version of the bond during her own captivity, apparently hoping the gesture might demonstrate her loyalty and ease her circumstances. A decision that later, once Parliament converted the bond's informal threat into the formal 1585 Act for the Queen's safety, would help supply the exact legal framework used to try and condemn her. The Act specifically permitted the trial of any claimant to the throne found complicit in a plot against Elizabeth's life, provision drafted with Mary specifically in mind, and one that transformed what might otherwise have remained an unresolved diplomatic standoff into a matter the English state now possessed clear statutory authority to resolve through. exactly the kind of tribunal that convened at Fotheringhay 2 years later. Hard cut. 45 commissioners, drawn from among England's most senior noblemen and privy councillors, assembled at Fotheringhay Castle, second week of October 1586, to try a reigning queen for treason, a legal proceeding without any clean precedent in English history, since no reigning foreign monarch had ever before been formally arraigned before an English court. Mary herself understood immediately, and said so plainly to the commissioners when the proceedings opened, that the entire premise of the trial rested on shaky legal ground. She was not, and had never been, an English subject, and she argued with the same composed dignity Isabel and every other member of her household had watched her maintain through 19 years of far smaller humiliations, that no court in England possessed any legitimate jurisdiction over an anointed queen answerable to God alone. She refused initially to recognize the tribunal at all, a position she held for some hours before ultimately agreeing to answer the charges, rather than allow her silence to be read as an admission of guilt. She conducted her own defense without legal counsel, a restriction the commissioners refused to lift despite her repeated requests, working entirely from memory and from whatever fragments of the intercepted correspondence the prosecution chose to read aloud. Since she was denied access to her own papers and to the original letters supposedly proving her guilt, the central evidence against her was the Babington correspondence this hour has already examined in detail. The cipher letters Philippus had intercepted, decoded, and in the case of the critical postscript, quietly altered. Mary denied ever authorizing an assassination, and she pointed out with real legal precision that the evidence being read against her consisted entirely of copies and translations, rather than her own original letters in her own hand, a distinction her prosecutors dismissed. Have generally acknowledged as a legitimate procedural objection that the Commission chose not to take seriously. The trial proceeded over 2 days, adjourned briefly, and reconvened at Westminster without Mary present, where the commissioners formally returned a verdict of guilty, finding that she had, in the language of the court, compassed and imagined matters tending to the death and destruction of the Queen's own royal person. For Isabel and the small remnant of the household still permitted to attend Mary during these weeks, the atmosphere at Fotheringhay carried a particular suffocating dread that felt different from every earlier danger this hour has described, not the sudden sharp fear of an approaching army or a midnight search, but something slower and considerably more certain, a legal machine grinding forward with a verdict that had, in every meaningful sense, already been decided before the commissioners ever sat down. Isabel remembers standing outside the great hall during portions of the proceedings, catching fragments of Mary's own voice through the heavy door, steady and unhurried, even as she argued a case she must have understood. By that point, she had almost no realistic chance of winning. Even after the verdict, Elizabeth herself hesitated for months over whether to actually sign the death warrant that would send her royal cousin to the block, a hesitation the historian John Guy has characterized as genuine and prolonged rather than mere political theatre, reflecting Elizabeth's own real discomfort with the precedent of one anointed monarch authorizing the execution of another. Parliament, meanwhile, pressed hard for Mary's death, petitioning Elizabeth repeatedly through the closing months of 1586, and the broader English public, fed a steady diet of reports about the Babington plot's aims, had grown increasingly convinced that Mary's continued survival represented an intolerable and ongoing threat to the Queen's own life. Elizabeth finally signed the warrant on the 1st of February 1587, and then, in a final display of the same genuine ambivalence that had delayed the decision for months, attempted afterward to countermand the order only for her own council, led by Walsingham, to proceed with the execution before any countermand could arrive at Fotheringhay. The broader context surrounding this trial reveals something worth sitting with about the particular legal and political bind Elizabeth's government found itself in by the autumn of 1586. Executing a foreign anointed queen set a precedent that troubled monarchs across Europe, and Elizabeth's own hesitation reflected a genuine awareness that she was authorizing something with implications well beyond Mary's individual case, a demonstration, uncomfortable to nearly everyone involved, that royal blood no longer guaranteed automatic protection from a state that judged a monarch's continued existence too dangerous to tolerate. The historian Jenny Wormald has argued that the trial itself, whatever its genuine procedural flaws, reflected a government that had, by this point, run out of patience with nearly 2 decades of plots, rumors, and diplomatic complications that Mary's mere continued presence in England had generated. Regardless of how directly involved in any individual conspiracy she had actually been, there is a quiet observation worth carrying forward from this chapter into the one that follows. Isabel had spent 19 years learning every discipline her queen's captivity required of her: patience, discretion, the careful management of fear, and none of it, in the end, had any bearing on the verdict a room full of English noblemen had reached before she was ever permitted to argue her own case in full. The trial closed a door that had in truth been closing slowly for years, and the household that had survived so much together now faced the one ending none of them had ever fully allowed themselves to imagine. The morning of the 8th of February, 1587, arrived at Fotheringhay Castle, grey and cold, and everything this hour has already described: the damp, the illness, the surveillance, the fear, at every dinner table, the secret mass behind closed shutters, the beer barrel that had once seemed to promise a small measure of freedom, arrived with it. Dot carried inside the small remaining household that had followed Mary through 19 years of captivity, and would now, in the space of a single morning, watch it end. If you picture a royal execution of this period at all, you probably picture something abrupt, a swift and almost businesslike procedure conducted with minimal ceremony. What actually unfolded inside the Great Hall at Fotheringhay that morning was considerably more deliberate and considerably more consciously staged by the one person in the room who still controlled how the moment would be remembered: the condemned queen herself. Mary was permitted only a small number of her own household to accompany her into the hall itself, 6 in total, 4 men and 2 women. A restriction imposed despite her repeated requests for a larger attendance, and the 2 women chosen for that final duty, both of whom had served her for years, and both of whom Mary trusted completely with what she clearly understood would be the most consequential physical tasks of her entire life. She entered the hall dressed in black, a formal gown of dark satin and velvet that gave no outward hint of what lay under it, and she carried herself, according to the eyewitness accounts later gathered by contemporaries, composed dignity that Isabel and every other member of her household had watched her maintain through nearly 2 decades of far smaller trials. After prayers and after the presiding officials read the commission authorizing her execution, Mary's own women Jane Kennedy and Elizabeth Curl, assisted by the executioner himself, began the deliberate work of removing her outer garments. What stood revealed beneath it was not simple mourning attire, but a bodice and petticoat of deep crimson, the specific liturgical color of Catholic martyrdom. A final and unmistakable statement, planned in advance and executed with total control, that she intended to die not as a convicted traitor, but as a queen suffering for her faith. It was, by every account that survives, a striking sight in its own right. Deliberate piece of visual argument staged in the one arena still left to her, and it left a considerable impression on everyone present in that hall, allies and executioners alike. Jane Kennedy then took up a white cloth embroidered in gold, a Corpus Christi cloth Mary herself had specifically selected for this final purpose, and according to the account preserved by the historian John Guy, kissed the fabric before binding it gently over her mistress's eyes, a small tender gesture performed by a woman who had spent years of her own life in this queen's service, and who was now, in the last moments available to her, offering the only comfort left within her power to give. Mary knelt, recited a psalm in Latin, and positioned her head upon the block, and the executioner's first blow, by most surviving accounts, failed to sever her neck cleanly, requiring a second stroke to complete what should have been a single decisive motion. A detail the household's own witnesses carried with them for the rest of their lives, and one that later accounts, sympathetic to Mary's memory, would repeat as further evidence of the ordeal's particular cruelty. One further detail, small and strange and entirely documented, belongs here as well. After the execution was complete, those attending discovered that Mary's own small dog, a Skye Terrier she had kept close through her final months, had followed her into the hall undetected, hidden beneath her skirts, and had remained pressed against her body throughout the entire proceeding, emerging only afterward, distressed and refusing, for some time, to leave her side. It is the kind of detail easy to treat as a small, sentimental footnote, and it is also, examined closely, a final and plainly accurate reflection of exactly what this hour has spent so many hours describing. A queen surrounded, right up to her very last moment, by small loyal creatures. To stay close to her regardless of the cost. For Isabel, who was not among the 6 household members permitted into the hall itself, but who waited instead in an adjoining chamber with the remainder of Mary's staff, the morning passed in a silence she would later describe in whatever fragments of memory this composite account can draw upon as the longest of her entire life. Straining to hear anything through walls that offered no real information at all, until word finally reached the waiting household that it was over. Dominic Bourgoin, Mary's own physician, present in the hall as the one medical witness her household had been permitted, would go on to record the details of that final morning in a journal that remains, to this day, one of the primary sources historians rely on for understanding exactly what happened inside that room. Exact attention turned, in the end, toward the one patient whose suffering he could no longer do anything to relieve. In the hours and days that followed, English officials moved quickly and deliberately to prevent Mary's remaining possessions, and even the blood-soaked wood of the scaffold itself, from becoming physical relics for her Catholic sympathizers to venerate, ordering much of what had touched her burned rather than distributed. Despite that effort, Mary's own household worked, in whatever small ways remained available to them, to preserve what they could of her memory, personal items, a handful of letters, small devotional objects, carried carefully out of England by servants who eventually made their way to the continent. Jane Kennedy herself returned to Scotland and later drowned in a shipwreck only a few years afterward, a death contemporaries could not help but read as its own small, bitter postscript to a life spent in devoted service. Elizabeth Curll settled eventually in Antwerp, where she lived out her remaining decades and where she commissioned a memorial portrait of Mary that survives today, a painted attempt, decades after the fact, to preserve some fragment of the Queen. There is a quiet observation worth sitting with here before this hour steps back to consider what the whole of this story actually reveals. The particular horror of that February morning was never simply the fact of an execution, brutal as any execution inevitably is. It was the fact that everything this hour has spent so many chapters describing, the damp, the illness, the surveillance, the poison fear, the secret faith, the fragile hope carried inside a beer barrel, had been building, in retrospect, toward exactly this single, carefully staged, deliberately dignified final morning. And the household that had endured all of it alongside her, Isabel included, now had to find some way to carry the whole of that memory forward into lives that would, for most of them, continue for decades in a world that had already begun, within weeks, to argue over what her death had actually meant. Step back now from the individual chambers of this particular 19-year story, and a handful of larger patterns come into view, patterns that connect the damp plaster of Tutbury to the crimson petticoat revealed in the Great Hall at Fotheringhay, patterns that say something considerably larger about this specific captivity and about what it actually costs a body and a household to sustain the outward form of royalty long after the substance of it has been taken away. The first pattern concerns the sheer, accumulated weight of the ordinary. It would be easy to imagine Mary's captivity as a series of dramatic set pieces, a rebellion here, a plot there, a trial, an execution, each one distinct and self-contained. The actual texture of those 19 years, examined through the letters and household accounts this hour has drawn on, was built overwhelmingly from smaller, less dramatic material, damp stockings that never fully dried, a dispute over firewood conducted in a cold outer passage, rosary hidden inside a loose floorboard. Isabel Carruthers spent far more of her 2 decades in Mary's service managing these small, unglamorous realities than she ever spent responding to any single dramatic crisis. And the same is almost certainly true of the Queen she served. Captivity, examined this closely, turns out to be made mostly of Tuesdays, ordinary days repeated with grinding consistency until the accumulated weight of 19 years' worth of them becomes, in retrospect, indistinguishable from tragedy. The second pattern concerns the particular, corrosive relationship between a body and the walls that contain it. This hour has returned, again and again, to the specific physical cost Mary's imprisonment extracted from her, the rheumatism that crippled her before 40, the headaches, the abdominal attacks, the slow transformation from an athletic young woman into someone who required assistance to cross a room. None of that decline was incidental to her captivity. It was produced by it, directly and cumulatively, by damp stone walls chosen for their remoteness from the sea rather than their suitability for human habitation, by years of restricted movement, by the compounding stress of constant surveillance and repeated political crisis. Mary's jailers were not, for the most part, men who set out to harm her physically. Shrewsbury built her an entire bathhouse at Buxton, specifically to ease her suffering. But the fundamental architecture of her confinement, chosen by a government focused entirely on security rather than health, guaranteed a slow, grinding physical toll that no amount of individual kindness. The body, in this story, was never separate from the politics that contained it. It absorbed those politics directly, joint by joint, year by year. The third pattern concerns the particular, quiet heroism of the people who chose to stay. 19 years is an extraordinarily long time to voluntarily attach one's own life to a losing cause, and Mary's household was, by any reasonable calculation, exactly that. A queen with a vanishingly small realistic chance of ever recovering her throne, watched constantly, growing more isolated with each passing decade. And eventually condemned to death by a foreign court she had never fully recognized as having authority over her at all. And yet women like Jane Kennedy and Elizabeth Curl remained at her side for years, through every one of the dangers this hour has described, right up to the final morning at Fotheringhay, when they were the two chosen from an entire household to perform the last most intimate services any servant could ever be asked to render a mistress they loved. Isabel Carruthers, standing in for the many gentlewomen whose individual names the historical record never preserved, made the same choice, year after year, long after any reasonable calculation of self-interest would have suggested she seek a quieter, safer position elsewhere. This loyalty was not naive. Every one of these women understood, with complete clarity, exactly what continued proximity to Mary Stuart could eventually cost them. They stayed anyway, and that choice, repeated daily across 19 years by an entire small household of ordinary people, deserves to be remembered as its own particular form of courage, considerably quieter than the courage displayed on any battlefield, but no less real for its quietness. The fourth pattern concerns the specific way Mary insisted, across the whole of her captivity, on maintaining the outward forms of a royalty that her actual circumstances had already stripped from her in every practical sense. She demanded a canopy of estate. She required her servants to observe full royal etiquette in a household that had, by any objective measure, become a prison. She staged her own execution quite deliberately as a piece of visual religious argument, choosing every element of her final costume with the same careful attention she had once brought to sitting for a state portrait. None of this was vanity in any simple, dismissible sense. It was examined closely, a sustained act of self-preservation conducted through ceremony and appearance, a woman insisting, in the only language still fully available to her, that her captors had taken her freedom and would eventually take her life, but had never once succeeded in taking away the fact of who she actually was. The historian Antonia Fraser has argued that this insistence on ceremonial dignity, maintained right up to the final moment, represents one of the most striking features of Mary's entire captivity, a refusal to allow 19 years of humiliation. There is a fifth pattern worth naming here. Quieter than the other four, and considerably harder to document from the surviving record, since it left behind almost no direct trace in the official papers historians usually rely on. The women of Mary's household did not simply endure their circumstances in isolation from one another. They built, across 19 years of shared hardship, a working system of mutual support and quiet solidarity that functioned as its own genuine counterweight to the surveillance and danger this hour has described in such detail. Isabel learned the household's earliest survival rules from women who had already learned them the hard way. Gentle women covered for one another's exhaustion during the worst flare-ups of the Queen's illness, took turns absorbing the particular grief of watching her decline, and shared whatever small comforts a household under constant strain could still produce. A warmed brick on a cold night, a quiet word before a difficult audience. Sustaining fact of not having to carry the whole weight of that captivity entirely alone. It is worth resisting, in light of this pattern, any account of Mary's imprisonment that reduces the women inside it to isolated figures, each managing her own survival in total solitude. They were doing that, certainly. Every one of them carrying her own private fears this hour has tried to make visible. But they were also, in whatever quiet ways the record allows a modern listener to glimpse, doing it together. And that collective, largely undocumented endurance may be the single truest thing this hour has to say about what actually sustained Mary Stuart through 19 years that would have broken almost anyone facing them entirely alone. A sixth and final pattern belongs here as well, one that connects everything this hour has described to a broader question about how history itself gets remembered. The record that survives from Mary's captivity, the letters, the household accounts, the physician's journal, the trial transcripts, was overwhelmingly produced by men, jailers, ambassadors, counselors, and commissioners, writing for other men in positions of power. Daily labor of that captivity appear in those documents, when they appear at all, as brief, incidental mentions rather than as the central figures their actual lives would justify. This is not a flaw unique to Mary's story. It is a pattern that runs through nearly all surviving records of this period, a systematic undercounting of exactly the kind of unglamorous, sustained female labor that made any great household of this era. Recovering even a partial, necessarily composite picture of women like Isabel Carruthers requires reading the surviving record deliberately against its own grain, treating a wardrobe account's brief notation or a passing reference in an ambassador's dispatch. None of this is offered as a simple verdict on the two queens at the center of this story, whose relationship history has flattened across 4 centuries of retelling into a convenient rivalry that obscures considerably more. Mary Stuart was neither the tragic, blameless martyr some later Catholic accounts preferred, nor the reckless conspirator hostile Protestant accounts were equally eager to describe. She was a deposed queen navigating a truly impossible position with the tools her century actually gave her: ceremony, faith, careful correspondence, and, in the end, a fatal willingness to entertain a rescue that cost her everything. Elizabeth, for her part, was neither a simple tyrant nor a reluctant bystander, but a monarch facing a real and sustained threat to her own life and her own throne, who delayed the hardest decision of her reign for months precisely because she understood its weight, and who authorized, in the end, an execution she seems never to have fully made peace with afterward. Holding both of these complicated truths in the same frame, a queen who represented a genuine danger and a queen who suffered at real and considerable length for representing it, is considerably harder than choosing one simple story and discarding the other. And it is exactly the discipline this hour has tried to practice throughout. For the queen at the center of this story, and for the household that carried so much of its weight alongside her, it is worth pausing before this hour returns to the room where it began, to ask what became of the wider circle of people who spent those 19 years orbiting Mary Stuart's captivity, because their own later lives complete the story this hour has been telling in ways a simple account of the execution alone would leave unfinished. Sir Francis Walsingham, whose intelligence network had done more than any single factor to bring about Mary's downfall, lived only a few years beyond her execution, dying in 1590 in circumstances made considerably harder by debts he had accumulated funding his own extensive network of agents and informants, largely from his personal resources. A final, quietly ironic detail for a man who had spent decades protecting his queen's finances as carefully as her security. Thomas Phillips, the cryptographer whose skill had broken Mary's supposedly secure cipher, continued working in government intelligence for years afterward, though his own later career grew considerably more troubled. Entangled, eventually in financial difficulties and periods of imprisonment for debt that make for an oddly deflating coda to the work that had once determined the fate of a queen, George Talbot, Earl of Shrewsbury, outlived Mary by nearly a decade, dying in 1590, still formally estranged from Bess of Hardwicke, the marriage that had once produced the very needlework this hour opened with never fully repaired despite years of legal and financial wrangling between them. Bess herself outlived her husband by more than 2 decades, continuing to build the great houses, most famously Hardwicke Hall itself, that had already made her one of the most formidable builders in English history, and dying in 1608 as one of the wealthiest women in the entire kingdom. Her own complicated years overseeing a captive queen's household folded into a far longer, and, in material terms, at least, considerably more triumphant life story than the one Mary herself had been permitted to finish. Sir Amias Paulet, Mary's final and strictest keeper, returned to a career in royal service following her execution. Dying in 1588, the year after his most consequential assignment finally ended, a man history remembers, almost entirely through the lens of the one prisoner he had been assigned to guard with such severe and deliberate thoroughness. Elizabeth herself reigned for a further 16 years after signing her cousin's death warrant, and by most surviving accounts never fully escaped the discomfort of that decision, reportedly weeping upon hearing news of the execution and publicly blaming her own secretary, William Davison, for allowing the warrant to be dispatched without her final personal confirmation, an act of political theatre that convinced almost nobody at the time, but that reflects, all the same, just how uneasily this particular monarch carried the weight of what she had ultimately authorized. For the small household that had followed Mary through her long captivity, the years after Fotheringhay scattered them across Europe in ways that mirror, in miniature, the larger religious and political fractures of the age they had all lived through together. Jane Kennedy, as this hour has already noted, returned north to Scotland and drowned in a shipwreck only a handful of years later, her own life cut short by exactly the kind of ordinary maritime accident. Elizabeth Curl settled permanently in the Spanish Netherlands, in Antwerp, where she lived for decades in a Catholic community that continued to venerate Mary's memory long after England itself had moved on to other concerns, and where the memorial portrait she commissioned, showing Mary in death exactly as her household had chosen to remember her, still hangs today as one of the most direct physical links between this story and the living, breathing devotion of the women who actually lived it. Dominique Bourgoin carried word of the execution back across the Channel to the French court, delivering his report to King Henry III and continuing, in the years that followed, to serve as one of the primary sources historians rely on for reconstructing exactly what those final months inside Mary's household had actually been like. Isabel Carruthers, standing in this account for the many gentlewomen whose individual fates the historical record simply never preserved, would have faced, like her real counterparts, an uncertain future once her queen's household formally ceased to exist. Some of these women returned to Scotland, to families who had, in many cases, moved on considerably in the 2 decades since their daughters had first ridden south into English captivity. Others, like Elizabeth Curl, found their way into the close, tightly knit communities of English and Scottish Catholic exiles scattered across Catholic Europe, communities built substantially around the shared memory of exactly the Queen and the years of service this hour has spent so long describing. Whatever path Isabel's own fictional life took after February of 1587, she carried with her something the historical record, fragmentary as it is, confirms that real women like her did carry forward a body marked by 2 decades of cold stone floors and damp bedchambers, hands still capable, after everything, of fine and patient needlework, and a store of memories nobody outside that household would ever fully understand or believe, since so much of what she had witnessed left no trace whatsoever in any official document a later historian might one day discover. There is a final piece of this aftermath worth naming plainly before this hour returns, at last, to the room where its own story began. Mary's body itself was not immediately released to her family or her supporters for burial, but was instead embalmed and kept for several months at Fotheringhay before Elizabeth finally ordered a formal, notably subdued, funeral at Peterborough Cathedral that summer. A ceremony conducted with considerably less ceremony than her rank would ordinarily have demanded. It was not until 1612, a full quarter century later, that her own son, James, by then King of both Scotland and England, following Elizabeth's death in 1603, arranged for her remains to be moved to Westminster Abbey and reinterred in a tomb considerably grander. Monument that stands today only a short distance from Elizabeth's own 2 cousins, who spent so much of their adult lives as each other's most consequential problem, now resting within the same building for the whole of eternity. A final, quietly strange piece of historical symmetry. News of the execution, once it reached the continent, provoked a sharply mixed reaction that reflected the same complicated political reality this hour has tried to honor throughout. Catholic Europe reacted with real outrage. Spain's King Philip II already preparing the naval campaign that would become the Armada, treated Mary's death as fresh justification for a planned invasion of England he had been contemplating for years on other grounds entirely. And the Pope himself denounced the execution from Rome in terms that briefly made Mary in death a considerably more potent symbol for European Catholicism than her own limited political power had ever made her in life. France's reaction proved notably more restrained, a diplomatic coolness that reflected the complicated, often strained relationship Mary had maintained with the French court since her own years as its young queen consort decades earlier, and her son James, already ruling Scotland in his own right and increasingly focused on his own eventual claim to the English throne once Elizabeth herself died without an heir, offered only a muted, carefully calculated protest that prioritized his own future prospects over any full-throated defense of the mother. Return, now, to the room this hour opened inside, a chamber at Sheffield Manor Lodge sometime in the middle years of the 1572, where a queen sits near a window with a needle in her hand, drawing coloured silk through linen in short, even strokes. Virescit vulnere virtus. Virtue grows stronger from a wound. It looked, at the start of this hour, like a picture of quiet, contained leisure, a woman with nothing more pressing to occupy her than a piece of embroidery and the companionable silence of another woman working beside her. You know now that composed, unhurried afternoon actually rested on, and what it cost to maintain it. You know that the room itself, wherever in the rotation of Shrewsbury's properties it happened to be that particular week, was very likely damp under its tapestries. The same damp that had soaked into the wet plaster at Tutbury Castle from the very first week of Mary's arrival there in February of 1569. Chosen for its distance from any coastline a rescue might use, rather than for any consideration of what 19 years inside a marshy, 400-year-old fortress would do to a young queen's joints. You know that the needle moving so steadily through that linen belonged to hands that would, within a decade, barely be able to hold a pen, rheumatism spreading through her body with such severity that by 1581 she required a servant on either side simply to cross a room carried between chambers in a chair. Treated across 2 decades by physicians named Margarin du Castel and later Dominique Bourgoin, working with hot poultices cupping the mineral waters at Buxton, that Shrewsbury built an entire lodging house specifically to provide her access to. You know that the calm surrounding this queen at her needlework was itself a form of constant, exhausting labor, performed by a household that had grown, over the years of her captivity, to 40 or 50 people, French and Scottish servants locked in a near-constant, grinding negotiation with Shrewsbury's own English staff over firewood sufficient to warm her rooms and water clean enough to cook and wash with, disputes conducted in cold outer passages by gentlewomen like Isabel Carruthers, whose own aching shoulders and persistent winter cough never once appear in any formal household account, because nobody thought a lady-in-waiting's discomfort worth the ink required to record it. You know that every dish that reached this queen's table first passed through the hands of a designated taster, that her own apothecary kept a bezoar stone in a small gold bottle against the specific fear of poison, and that this fear was never eccentric paranoia, but a rational inheritance from a childhood spent moving through French and Scottish courts, saturated with poisoning accusations, real and invented in roughly equal measure. You know that somewhere in this same rotation of houses, behind a shuttered window with the priest's voice kept deliberately low, Mass was being said according to the old rite, a private chapel Mary had negotiated for and fought to maintain for the whole of her captivity, tolerated with weary pragmatism by Shrewsbury and, in her final year, restricted with open severity by Sir Amias Paulet, who stripped away even the canopy of estate that had once hung above her chair, the one remaining physical symbol of a royal status, her actual circumstances. You know that the marriage of the 2 people responsible for her daily keeping, George Talbot and the formidable Bess of Hardwicke, the very woman stitching silk beside her in this opening image, collapsed under the specific corrosive pressure of housing a captive queen for over a decade, leaving Mary caught in her final Shrewsbury years inside a household divided against itself. You know that in the final chapter of that long captivity at a house called Chartley Hall, Mary believed she had finally found a way to speak freely again. A system of cipher letters folded into a waterproof packet and slipped inside the hollow bung of an ordinary beer barrel, and you know that the entire channel had been built from its very first delivery by a double agent working for Sir Francis Walsingham. Every letter copied, deciphered by a cryptographer named Thomas Phelps, and in the case of one final, fatal postscript, quietly forged to remove any doubt about her own knowledge of a plot to kill her royal cousin. You know that this betrayal led directly to a trial at Fotheringhay Castle in October of 1586, proceeding Mary conducted without legal counsel and without access to her own original letters, arguing a case she almost certainly understood. And you know, finally, what this hour has spent its last hour describing in careful, unhurried detail. The morning of the 8th of February 1587, when Mary walked into the great hall at Fotheringhay, dressed in black, accompanied by only 6 members of a household that had once numbered 50. With the help of Jane Kennedy and Elizabeth Curl, to reveal a bodice and petticoat, the deep, deliberate crimson of Catholic martyrdom underneath it. You know that Jane Kennedy kissed a gold-embroidered cloth before binding it gently over her mistress's eyes, that a small dog followed her into that hall unnoticed and remained pressed against her body through the entire proceeding, and that her own physician, Dominique Burgoyne, recording in careful detail the final morning of a patient whose suffering he had spent years trying, with the limited tools his century actually gave him, to ease. None of this was visible in the quiet afternoon this hour opened inside. None of it needed to be. A queen's composure, in this era, and in nearly every era before or since, was never meant to advertise its own cost. Mary Stuart sits at that window with her needle moving steadily through linen, and, by every available measure, she succeeds completely at the narrow, difficult task her circumstances had set for her, which was never simply to survive her captivity, but to be seen surviving it with her dignity fully intact, regardless of what that dignity was actually costing her body and the small household, devoted enough to help her maintain it. She was not, despite everything this hour has described. She was, in the middle of all of it, still recognizably herself, a queen of genuine piety and real personal warmth toward the women and men who served her closely, a woman managing a body in open, escalating revolt against the very stone walls meant to contain her, a captive who never once, across 19 years, stopped insisting on the full ceremonial weight of who she had been born to be. And the women who dressed her, prayed beside her in secret, tasted her food, smuggled her letters, and in Jane Kennedy's and Elizabeth Curl's case, performed the last and most intimate service any servant could ever be asked to render a mistress they had chosen, year after year, to remain beside, deserved to be seen just as clearly as the queen they served. Not as background figures standing patiently at the edge of someone else's tragedy, but as women who mastered, out of devotion rather than simple necessity, one of the most demanding disciplines their century had to offer. The art of remaining steady beside someone the whole of that century had already decided was doomed. It would be easy enough to close this hour with a simple verdict on the 2 royal cousins at the center of this long story. Easy to reach for the flattened rivalry popular memory has settled into, one queen cast as martyr and the other as villain. Or to reverse those roles entirely and call it a more sophisticated reading. Neither version survives close contact with the actual women who lived inside Mary's household for 19 years. She governed no kingdom of her own by the end, and she still commanded a devotion history rarely extends to monarchs who lose everything so early and so completely. She plotted, however ambiguously, against the life of the cousin who held her, and she also spent 19 years enduring conditions that slowly and measurably destroyed her own body, conditions that same cousin's government chose, repeatedly, not to improve. Holding a seriously compromised political record and a deeply sympathetic human being in the same frame is considerably harder than picking one story and discarding the other. And it is exactly the discipline this hour has tried to practice for the Queen, its centre, and for the household that carried so much of her story quietly forward alongside her. The candles in that Sheffield chamber have burned down long since, wherever this hour has actually left them. Mary Stuart's tomb stands today in Westminster Abbey, a short walk from the cousin signed her death warrant. Two queens sharing the same quiet stone building for longer now than either of them ever shared a single room in life. And Thomas More never painted this particular queen the way he painted her Tudor predecessor, but her own household did something in its own way more lasting. They carried her memory out of England in scattered fragments. A commissioned portrait in Antwerp, a physician's journal delivered to the French court, a name entered into a convent's records. In the case of women like the one this hour has called Isabel Carruthers, nothing more than a body that remembered, for the rest of its own life, exactly what 19 years beside a captive queen had actually felt like, against the skin. You know her now, this composite thread, through everything this hour has described, and you know what her steadiness beside that needlework in 1,570 seconds Sheffield was actually built from. Sleep well tonight, in whatever quieter century you happen to be resting in, and spare a thought, if you can, for the women who stayed until the very end of a story that offered them no realistic hope of a happy one, and who made every quiet, dignified hour of it possible.